Some other things, some other housekeeping things. Before we get started, we'd like to mention that this session is underwritten by the CU Environmental Center, which is helping us to reduce the CWA's environmental impact. The center support has enabled the CWA to purchase carbon offsets for speaker airline travel, to reduce its paper consumption by creating our app that hopefully you guys are using, and to promote our live streaming platform, and to offer free HOP bus service, HOP bus service. We encourage you to make use of these resources during your time at the CWA conference. Okay, next part of the housekeeping. In this CWA session, we will be utilizing both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select the session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from our producer, Carly, over here. You must write legibly. That is the baseline. And if you're a student, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. So I'm set up here to get your online questions. Carly can get you for the note cards. Okay, so just to introduce me so you know who I am, I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Mara Fleischman, and I am the CEO of the Chef Ann Foundation. The Chef Ann Foundation is a national nonprofit headquartered here in Boulder, Colorado. We help schools across the country create healthier school food by supporting them in moving from processed eat and serve to a cook from scratch program, which allows them to procure individual ingredients and often allows them to procure local ingredients, which they would not be able to do if they were buying a processed chicken nugget with 30 ingredients from very far away locations. So that's, I think, how I relate to this topic a little bit, beyond the fact that I was with Whole Foods Market for 13 years before that, helping around food system work. So we have an awesome panel today for the real food security and the future of small family farms. I'm really excited about it. And I'm going to start just with a little bit of an introduction down on the end. We have Raul Adamchak, and Raul manages the 7-acre certified organic market garden at the UC Davis Student Farm. Raul has been growing vegetables organically for over 24 years and has an MS in International Agriculture Development from UC Davis. One of the cool things that he told me is that they have a 108-member CSA, and that they grow over 50 different varieties of veggies at this garden. And the cool thing about it is that it does support the cafeteria at UC Davis, which is really cool. So glad to have you here, Raul. Then next to Raul is Woody. Woody Tash is a local hero here from Boulder. Woody has really spent his whole work life in investment organizations that support sustainable and meaningful work. He's the founder of Slow Money, if any of you guys have heard of Slow Money, and a 2-time author. His first book, Inquiries into the Nature of Slow Money, and his most recent book that just recently came out, which is called Soil, and it's about the practice of nurture capital. I'm really glad to have Woody on the panel. And then next to Woody, we have David Montgomery. David is a MacArthur Fellow and a professor of geomorphology at the University of Washington. He's authored more than 200 scientific papers and 5 popular science books, including Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization. So I don't know if you're asking yourself this, but I did when I read his bio. What is geomorphology or a geomorphologist? So I just thought I'd tell you guys in case you wanted to know, because I didn't know.
It's fake.
So geomorphology is the study of physical features of the surface of the Earth and the relation to geological structures. The study includes looking at landscapes to work out how the Earth's surface is processed, such as air, water, and ice. So we're getting some real in-depth knowledge here. Next to David is Christina Tobias Nahi. So Christina has been heading up the public affairs at the Islamic Relief USA since 2006. Really, when you read her bio, her list of degrees in education goes on for miles. But one thing is clear when you look at what she's accomplished, she really cares about building strong communities and empowering women globally. So we're really excited to have her on the panel. So we're going to go and start with Raul, and we're going to ask you to kind of just speak generally to your work and your experience and how that relates to the future of small farms and real food security. And then as you guys hear them speak, you can start to type in your questions, and I've got some questions on the end, and we'll just flow through. So let's kick it off with you, Raul.
Okay, thank you for all coming this afternoon. I am the farm manager at the UC Davis Student Farm, and the purpose of the student farm is to provide UC Davis students with the hands-on experience of farming that 99% of them did not grow up with. They're ag majors, but they didn't grow up on a farm, and they learn a lot of agriculture in their classes, but being able to tie it together with what's going on in the field is really important. But what we've set up as a experiential learning tool is a farm we've expanded to 9 acres now of certified organic vegetables that we have the students plan and grow and harvest and sell through our CSA. We have a 108-member CSA. We sell to the dining service on campus, and we sell at an on-campus farmers market and to the coffee house. And we are a local small farm that is very typical of the small farms in our region. And some of the things that have made our farm and other small farms work is that we do a lot of direct marketing. So the CSA, we grow the produce, we sell it to our subscribers, and they pay ahead of time. We get all the money, and it helps us succeed economically as a farm. It builds a community. So our CSA members are students, faculty, and staff. And in having them as our subscribers, we've built a community support system within the university. And that's true if you're a private farmer outside the university or not. Having a CSA builds a support group that can help you economically, that can help you politically. So that direct marketing and that support group are critical for small farmers in any situation. Going to farmers market, we meet people face to face, and also build community. And these aspects of what we teach at the farm and what we do at the farm make the viability of small farms into the future very likely. It's difficult to start a farm. You know, you have to be very committed to the idea, and you need a certain amount of capital. But if you can set up systems where you can grow produce and sell produce and get the support from the community to keep you going, then this model can be used indefinitely into the future because there's a demand for fresh local produce everywhere. So as long the one challenge and one contradiction in this is that small farmers are relatively low income people. There were years when I was farming where we paid our employees more than we earned as the owners because we had bad things happen, a freeze, a wholesaler going out of business. And so when you see those small farmers at the farmers market, or the people that you're buying your share from the CSA from, those are not wealthy people. And they need support from the community if they're going to survive. So, you talk about food security and small farms. Yes, small farmers contribute to that, but they're not as secure as we would like them to be. One last point is, it turns out that on the UC Davis campus, and maybe on this campus as well, food insecurity is a big issue. So on the UC Davis campus, 45% of the students come from families that earn less than $50,000 a year. So you pay tuition, you support your family. The students that you've sent to college don't have enough money to buy food. So at the UC Davis Student Farm, we've set up a program to divert our surplus and our second quality produce to a food pantry on campus where students can get the food for free. And last year we donated 10,000 pounds of produce from the farm to this food pantry, and it all disappeared. So it's, when you talk about food security, you think, oh, well, we're talking about low-income communities, we're talking about food deserts. It's everywhere. We have a economic system that's very unequal, and even though it seems like college students should be immune to food insecurity, indeed they're not. So as a local farm, that's one of our goals, is not only to provide fresh local produce to the people that can afford it, we want to provide it as well to the people that can't afford it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Raul. That's amazing. Okay, I'm going to get back to you on nutrition insecurity afterwards. Woody, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and how it relates to our topic today?
Well, it's great to go after Raul, because everything he said is kind of a lead into me to describe what we're doing in Slow Money, which you could describe as a community-based financial approach to trying to create more security for the farmers. So, meaning, what would we are in Boulder. Last night we had our first meeting in Boulder of something called SOIL. Stands for Slow Opportunities for Investing Locally. Think about it. Spells SOIL.
Good, it's good.
At least I hope it does. And we are making 0% loans to small, diversified local organic farmers and all the food entrepreneurs who bring their product to the local market. So it could be small processors, farm-to-table restaurant, seed company, et cetera. So just imagine, in response to what Raul just said, and I'm guessing most people in this room, since you came into this session at a conference which is dealing with lots of big global issues, to talk about small farms, you probably either directly or intuitively recognize that small farms are actually a big issue. It's really an important thing for cultural and ecological and political, all kinds of things. So if we want to help Raul and everybody that he represents the way he just did, everything from him as a small farmer to all the other community implications that he was just describing, we're going to need some new way to do that, because there's no system for doing that right now. And so that's what really about Slow Money as a whole is, just a movement of people around the country who are banding together in various ways to put a little of their money to work locally in the local food system, with a priority on small, diversified organic farming and keeping the food as local and as fresh as possible. My soil book goes all the way down into the soil itself, and talking about soil fertility, and which of course is the basis for all of this. I would say here's a way to connect the small to the big. If we can't grow food in a way that does not destroy life in the soil, we might have a long-term problem of various kinds, everything from climate change to soil erosion to aquifer depletion to nutrition to, I mean, it's all tied together. So maybe that's enough on that just as a brushstroke at the beginning. But I found myself thinking about small is beautiful since it's just talking about small and big, and since we're at a university setting, I did just want to say, I wanted to ask, how many people here have read the book Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher? Okay, this is a tragic educational failing. I'm not saying it at CU, by the way. I'm saying it at our country, right? So E.F. Schumacher was a Rhodes Scholar, a senior economist for the British Coal Board after World War II. So a senior industrial economist, heavily based in the carbon economy, who in middle age had a kind of an epiphany. It happened to involve going to the Far East, but you know, you could view that as anecdotal information. And he realized that Western economics was out of sync with human nature and spirituality, with natural systems and spirituality. And he wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, which is as relevant today. It was written in 1973, and he basically said, unlimited economic growth on a finite planet is impossible. Now, to this day, 99% of economists do not agree with that statement. So that's a whole nother, 99.9% of economists do not agree with that statement. I'm doing this for you because you're 0.99% of economists do not agree with it. So that's a whole conversation, and because it's a big global conversation about limits to growth and all kinds of things, it's highly subject to debate and ideology because it's pretty hard to really understand all that and come to a firm opinion. You have to kind of decide what you believe. But the second corollary, well, you believe it. This guy believes it, whoever he is, he believes it. But the other corollary brings it much closer to home, and I hope this will make you want to go read this book. I'm serious. I mean, that, to me, you should read David's books, you should read my books, read everybody's books, but go back and read E.F. Schumacher, because it is one of the seminal books of the 20th century, and it should be read by more people. The second corollary, first one was unlimited economic growth on a finite planet is impossible. So we can debate that one. I don't think anybody in this room will debate the second one, which is increased consumption is not synonymous with improved well-being, right? That brings it down to a personal level, right? You're not better off just because you consume more. And then it's like, what do you consume and how do you consume it and how it is produced and all these other things. So please check that out. That to me was one of the inspirations that got me so focused on the importance of small. And the last thing I would just say is slow money is focused on slow, small, and local. So these are like the pillars of, let's say, a countercultural, if I can use that word, reaffirmation of things that in the global industrial economy we lost sight of.
Thank you, Woody. Definitely putting that on my book list. Okay, David is next, so why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how it relates to our topic.
Okay. Well, I'm a geologist, so I look at things that are slow, global, and repetitive.
I knew I didn't really trust you.
But, you know, I got into thinking about farming practices from sort of the opposite way that most farmers would. I got into thinking about how rocks break down to form soils, how you make soils. I've studied that professionally in my geological life, but I also got into writing popular science books a little over a decade ago. And the second one that I wrote was the one that you might expect a geologist to write about farming. It looked backwards through history, at the sort of history of farming for the last 10,000 years. And one of the ways that that connects to the sort of small farm issue today is that if you look at what happened to American agriculture since colonial agriculture, it started, in the most part, at least in the northern states, as small-scale farms, and it's evolved today to very large, small diversified farms, and it's evolved today to very large-scale monocultures for the most part. That's not the first time that happened through history. And geology is a discipline that looks backwards through history. It's one of the historically contingent sciences. Evolutionary ecology, or evolution is one, geology is the other, because the sequencing of events influences the future sequencing of events. History actually matters in geology. So I looked back at the history of agriculture for the last 10,000 years, and the things that relate to the topic of this particular panel begin for me with what happened in Roman days to Roman agriculture. Because early in the Roman Republic, they practiced small-scale, diversified farms. They were family farms. They could basically feed the farmer, the people that worked on the farm, otherwise known as slaves in that time, and they practiced a polyculture, grew multiple crops on the same piece of land. By the end of the Roman Empire, they were practicing large-scale industrial monocultures. And that helped to deplete the soils of central Italy. Has anyone ever been to the port of Rome in Italy, Ostia? Can you see the ocean from there? No more. It's nowhere near the coast. And you don't build a port inland. It's hard to get those ships to the sea if they're on dry land. What happened? The soils of central Italy were eroded off by these intensive tillage, plow-based agricultural practices that came into prominence after the Romans sacked Carthage, which we all learned in school they did, and they salted the earth around there to take out their geopolitical rivals. What we don't learn in school is that the Romans then proceeded to destroy the soils of central Italy, wash the soil down to the coast, bury their own port. Then they were back in Carthage 200 years later farming the land they salted because they destroyed their own land. But they didn't intend to destroy their own land. Then what happened in the colonial U.S.? I'm going to skip over a whole lot of history in between. But that's why you write a book, right? It's all written down somewhere. You can go find it if you wish over where they're selling books across the way. But in the run-up to the Civil War in the United States, there was a similar transformation of farms in the South that ended up going from small-scale farms and plantations to very large-scale monocultures. And that led to the degradation of the land, which actually helped light the fuse that erupted in the Civil War. Now, there were obviously other issues going on in that time as well. But the one we don't teach, the one we don't think about, is how the degraded state of the land along the eastern seaboard set the stage. And if you're interested in that, there's a whole chapter on it in the Dirt book. The third experiment that we've done in terms of changing small-scale diversified family farms into large-scale monocultures is the one we went through in the 20th century in the United States. It's not the first time it happened. It also led to widespread degradation of the soil that we depend on for our food. We've depleted something like 50% of the soil organic matter in the farms of the United States. Iowa's lost half its topsoil so far. So has eastern Washington. I could go on, and I'm sure Woody has stuff in his soil book about this. But the point being that there has been a historical correlation between the shift from small-scale diversified farms to large-scale monocultures that has undercut the ability of future generations to support themselves on the same land. That brought up, when I wrote that book, it was kind of depressing by the time I got to the end of it, to be honest. And I put that issue aside, wrote a book about some non-controversial topics like the history of science and religion. But I got back into thinking about soils when my wife restored our garden in our yard in Seattle, because that got us into looking at the role of microbial life, all the bacteria and the fungi in the soil, the worms. Darwin's best book was his one he wrote about worms, the last one he wrote in his lifetime. I recommend it highly. It's right up there with Small is Beautiful. But that taught us essentially that we can restore soils really quite fast. We've transformed our yard into some place that had less than 1% carbon about 15 years ago to a place that now has about 10% carbon in our yard, and it's thriving. And that motivated the question of, could we do this at scale on farms around the world? So I wrote a third book, Growing a Revolution, the one that just came out that's still in hardback. Obviously, I recommend it to everyone. But in it, I went around and visited farms around the world to ask the question of, can we restore fertility to the land? And fortunately, the answer is yes, and we can do it quite fast. And we can do it at scale. I visited 20,000-acre farms in the Dakotas, but I also visited small farms in Costa Rica and in equatorial West Africa to look at whether small-scale subsistence farmers could use the same general principles of abandoning the plow, adopting no-till practices, growing cover crops, and growing a diversified suite of crops. That's the recipe for growing healthy, fertile soils. And it works on small farms, it works on large farms. And what I found, much to my delight, was that it not only can improve the fertility of the land, it can improve the profitability of farms, both small and large. And I actually think one of the great underappreciated opportunities that we have in the modern world is to, by restoring fertility to our farmland soils, to actually restore economic viability to small farms, both in the developed world and, importantly, in the developing world. There's some remarkable examples from Africa and Costa Rica in the book that where regions were transformed, not by the Green Revolution too, not by selling them products, but by teaching people a new suite of practices, a new way to think about the soil that transformed the fertility of their land, that allowed them to double or triple their crop yields in some cases. That was transformative, economically and socially, for them, and it built resilience into their communities. And I'll stop there and hand it over.
Thanks, David.
So David was just talking about what he studies that's slow, repetitive, and global. I think I was asked to be on this panel because I work with an organization that responds to what's slow, repetitive, and global. I work with Islamic Relief USA, and we were actually started in the UK, similar to Oxfam, to respond to the hunger crises that were going on in the famines in Africa specifically, and we continue to this day to respond to the ongoing famines and hunger crises. We are also more in the field of international food aid because we do international relief, and that's actually more of my area, is actually on disaster relief and food relief, and we are one of the primary partners of the World Food Program in Rome, and often the only partner that can get into some of these conflict areas such as Yemen, where we're helping to get food to people on the ground. That being said, we do a lot of work in the developing world with women, as was mentioned, in women's livelihoods, and being that women in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and a lot of the places we work, primarily their livelihood is farming. We're looking at the issues and trying to address the inequalities, that they own smaller plots of land, that they have less access to the markets, to credits, to the inputs like seeds and fertilizers, of course, to new technology. And added on to that is the burden that they're often alone in these endeavors because the men may have gone to more urban areas. They have the burden of household chores, so that gives them actually less time to kind of dedicate to their farms. And so thus their yields are lower, and we see a lot of hunger and malnutrition. Girls and women worldwide are disproportionately affected by hunger, and so that's something I'm happy to talk about later as well. I want to talk about as well, just because we do work here in the US and some of our partners, we do a lot of advocacy. We're based out of DC, at least our DC, I mentioned our worldwide is in the UK, but our US headquarters is in DC. And we do a lot of advocacy around hunger and food security, which is often surprising when we get on the Hill. People are surprised to see a faith organization, especially a Muslim faith organization, coming not to talk about counterterrorism or other issues security related, but we're actually there as a primary focus to talk about hunger and food security. And in the US, we do a lot of projects as well. We support a network of food pantries with a lot of faith communities. We work with partners such as Ample Harvest on the East Coast that actually tries to connect people that have their own community gardens with food insecure faith communities to get food to the mosques and the churches and to the synagogues. And we do a lot of advocacy with them, as well as we work as a close partner with the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a organization that gives funding and technical support to, again, faith communities and organizations that want to work to set up programs in the summer when children are out of school and go hungry. So we provide them actually with financial resources to do that. The Department of Agriculture does a lot of reimbursement programs, as you might know, for those that have these programs in place, but to have the seed money to actually start a program is what we do. And then we work a lot with state and local organizations as well, food banks. So I mentioned our network of faith food banks, but we also work with partners such as in Delaware with their food, their state food bank, doing programs to help get food to kids through school backpack programs that go home with them on the weekends. Again, looking at food insecurity issues across all communities. So we are an organization that works irrespective of race, ethnicity, gender, and of course religion. So kids go hungry everywhere in all communities, and so we work both internationally and the U.S. It's only one of the sectors we work in, but it probably is our primary sector because that's how we were founded and began our work.
That's great. Thank you. So I didn't lie. It's an amazing panel, and they're doing a lot of great work, and we have a lot of great questions both online and in the note cards. So I'm going to start off with them. Some are specific, and I'm going to start with this specific question for Raul. This is, I think I'm pronouncing her name right, Raya Burke, who is 13, I believe. So this question is for Raul. If you know that small farming is a hard business, why did you choose to go into it?
So
what's wrong with you?
I wandered in the desert for 7 years. Oh, I was in college for many years trying to figure out what the heck to do with my life, and I had this internship that I wandered into where they were teaching us small-scale agriculture and Spanish, and we were going to go work in Central America with this internship, and I started farming there on a small scale and just connected with it totally. And I have told, I mean, it made no economic sense, and my parents didn't jump up and down and say, wow, you became a small farmer, that's amazing. They hardly said anything. But you know, sometimes I've told students when they've asked that question, why did you become a small farmer? It's like, I was chosen by God to become a small farmer because there's no other rational reason. But I've been doing essentially the same thing now for 30 years and have enjoyed every season and feel like I've had a productive life and made a contribution to my community. And it's so rewarding that even though I'm not affluent, it's been a wonderful experience, and so it's quality of life that has really made it work.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. So this is a question I often struggle with, and this is going to be open to the panel. But here it is. Do we need global consumers to pay more for food as a percentage of total income, create more perceived value to sustain small farmers? Put it another way, is cheap food too cheap without monetizing the indirect collective costs? Basically, do we need to increase prices? Anyone want to go for that?
Well, I was going to say yes, so yes, I'll go for it, and the answer is yes.
Yes.
I mean, well, the how. So the how is already happening.
How?
I mean, so I'm not a policy. I'm very grassroots oriented about direct community action. Growing up, not that you need the autobiographical explanation, but growing up, coming of age in the 60s and 70s, I would like to say I got permission to be skeptical about politics. There's a whole bunch of other permissions being given today, and so. I think the answer is not going to come from policy and regulation, although we do need to chip away on all that stuff. The answer is already happening at the grassroots level through CSAs and farmers markets and people voting with their consumer dollars and whatnot. And it's still very fledgling and imperfect. The pendulum is still way over here on globalization and production of cheap, shelf-stable commodities, which is what modern agriculture does, industrial agriculture. But there are millions of people already voting every day to pay more for food and buy it as direct as possible from a farmer for all the reasons that we want to help the Raouls of the world. And we, not just because he's a nice guy and we feel sorry for him. And his parents are unhappy. But because we think we believe strongly there are deep benefits that go to the community and the environment and long-term cultural healing and peace and community and all kinds of other things that come out of this. So if you believe all those things, whatever the little bit more you'd pay for the food seems like a pittance, actually. That's how I view it. And there are millions of people starting to already do this. And the elitism question, which is behind that other question, which is, A, is it an elitist thing? And B, can you feed the whole world that way? Those are the other things which we might have to get into here. And I'll just say, yes, the whole world can be fed with small farms, zero question. We're wasting tons of food and land now doing all the industrial stuff, literally wasting it, it's washing away, et cetera. And yes, it is a little bit of an elitist thing at the beginning because it just is. You can't fix everything all at the same time. So the people who have some money and are beginning to be able to move in a direction, including the investors who do slow money and are willing to give up financial return in order to do some things, that's a form of reallocation of resources, from the cheapest to things that we value. So there's a lot. Anyway, I guess I didn't get away with just a yes.
So if I can talk about the dark side, though,
Yeah.
which is that is a wonderful ideal, but there are clearly people in this country and in the world that can't afford to pay a great deal for food. And here, maybe it manifests itself in people eating low-cost, low-quality food, but in other parts of the world, if the price of bread doubles, there's a war. You know, so it's important to pay the real cost of growing food, but it may impact a lot of lives in ways that we wouldn't like to see.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
I was just going to add on to that, where one of the lessons I learned in researching my most recent book was in visiting farmers who had restored fertility to their land. They were able to get away with using far less chemical inputs and far less diesel, which means their production costs were quite a bit lower. And I visited farmers who were not organic, but who were, I called them organic-ish, because they had so weaned themselves off of the modern agrochemical methods that they were far more profitable than their conventional neighbors. And it wasn't because it cost them more to produce stuff, and it wasn't because they were getting organic premium, because they were not organic farmers. But their costs of production were lower, the quality of the food was higher. And so, and even if you imagined turning conventional farmers around the world, in the developed world, into organic-ish farmers or organic farmers, I don't think that the per unit cost of production of better food would be much higher than it is today if more people were doing it. In the developing world, there's obviously differences in terms of feeding the developed and developing world, you know, just the ratio of people on the land, the size of farms, and so forth. But in the communities I was visiting in equatorial West Africa, they had a very similar experience where they managed to double their crop yields by changing their practices. It didn't cost them anything to change their practices. So they were growing twice as much food for the same labor, and actually it took them less time because they weren't plowing. So I think there's opportunities to try and address these issues that don't map directly onto what you find when you walk into Whole Foods today and the organic food is more expensive than the conventional food, or whatever place you like to buy your food. I think I think we can get a lot of mileage on this particular issue by thinking a little outside the box and maybe reimagining what we consider the contemporary conventional food system.
Thank you. We have a ton of questions. So I'm going to go to water use because there's a couple coming in about water use. It looks like they're mostly addressed to David and Woody, but I'll let you guys all see who wants to chime in. So here it says, please address, along with climate change challenges, the water crisis for farming in the future. And the other question is really around, in the areas where large-scale irrigation is an issue, what's the future of aquaculture, hydroponics? So kind of with the water issues that's going on, what do we see for the future? And is aquaponics, hydroponics a true solution for us, I guess? So who wants to jump in on that one?
I'll deflect to Woody.
So David mentioned the carbon in his garden going from 1% to 10%. So behind that is a whole carbon discussion, because carbon is actually the answer to is integral to the answer to the question. So soil that is rich with carbon retains water better. I'm oversimplifying. I'm not a scientist, but I know just enough to be slightly dangerous on a practical level. Right. So there are many reasons that carbon in the soil is very important, and it's not just water, but water is one of them. Very important. So just that. I mean, I just leave it at that. We could go into it in more detail, but if you have, here's the visual image. I was at a conference once quite a while ago, and the guy who is now running Rodale, Jeff Moyers, was then the soil trial guy there, doing no-till trials at Rodale, and he showed a slide that had a picture of 2 jars of water. Sometimes people do this actual demonstration, like you'll have the jars right on the table, and in one of the jars, or think of a pitcher this size, and one of them is all kind of murky, cloudy, just like mixed up muddy water. And the other one has floating in it a clod of dark, cohesive soil, and the water is crystal clear around it. Okay, the one that's muddy has very little carbon and organic matter, so it's subject to erosion and just runoff the one that is dark and holding water and allowing the water around it to remain crystal clear is rich in carbon. So that's just a visual thing. So the simple answer is organic agriculture is a very important water conservation thing. That's the subject to much more discussion if you want. The aquaponics and the hydroponic thing is a controversial issue in the organics industry for all kinds of political and certification reasons, meaning many of the berries that you had for breakfast this morning, if you ate berries, if you had like strawberries or blackberries, were probably grown hydroponically, but they're certified organic, and you didn't even know they were grown hydroponically. Now you say, well, why does that matter? There's a big debate. This is a debate. The soil people, the people who are deep into food should be grown in soil, so it can be rich in micronutrients and the systems of nature can be respected, believe that if you grow things in troughs of water with a few nutrients put in there, you don't get the same product. And there's a whole bunch of different issues, again, going back to carbon and the role of, the other thing I forgot to say in the carbon thing, really important, which David is way more knowledgeable about than I am, is that when you plow, he mentioned no-till also, but we didn't actually have a time to get into all that. When you plow, you release carbon from the soil into the atmosphere. It is a crazy thing to realize after let's say, a few centuries of developing the plow and industrializing. So carbon is still at the key of this whole thing. It's at the key of climate change, it's at the key of soil fertility health, and it's at the key of water retention. And I'll just leave the water question on hydroponics saying it's a controversial area in the organics field right now.
Great, thank you.
Just for fun,
Yeah.
Woody described the people opposed to hydroponics, but the people in favor of it think it's a great opportunity for urban agriculture, for locally produced food in places where there's not so much soil. And it cuts down on shipping costs, and I don't do it myself, but aquaponics, I've heard, especially greatly reduces water use. So there are benefits to it. And I guess my own personal point of view is that if it can be done organically, where there aren't toxic inputs that could affect the quality of the food, then I think that's better than if it's done with synthetic fertilizers or fungicides. So I think there are benefits to hydroponics and to organic hydroponics, but there are also challenges. Yeah.
Thank you.
And here comes some now, in fact.
Perfect timing.
Oh, look at that. The Tower Garden. Wow, that's cool. Okay, this one is, that was apropos. This one's for Christina. So, says Christina, what do you consider the best ways to protect small farms and farmers from bad events that can devastate in a single season? Large-scale operations have resources and diversification that smallholders don't have.
Okay, this is way beyond my area of expertise, so I'm going to have to deflect this one as well. What I mentioned earlier is I actually work more in the space of refugees. So I'm going to deflect that one, but I want to hopefully bring this back to the refugee issue later on. Someone want to take that? You're more knowledgeable than this.
Well, one of the side effects of what Woody was talking about in terms of putting more carbon back in the ground is that by having a greater water retention capacity, your crops will be more climate resilient. And there's good studies that show that farms that have adopted this sort of no-till cover crops and diversity style of farming can match conventional yields during good years, but in drought years they do better by up to 30%.
That's interesting.
So there's the whole issue in terms of climate and drought as a perturbation. That's a big issue. The other perturbation that farmers in the U.S. today are very vulnerable to, we're seeing play out in the sort of incipient trade war. Because farmers are squeezed between high input costs and low prices they get for their harvests. And a big disaster would be if for soybean farmers, for example, in the U.S., forgetting style of soybean just as a commodity. If the price goes through the floor because demand is cut off to a major market, that's going to translate into a disaster.
That's great. All right, one more came in for you, Christina. I think that's right for you. So, sorry. That one specifically, they
That was
spelled your
so
whole name
technical.
out right. I thought maybe there was some inside information they knew about. So, this one is, so basically in the global hunger relief industry, what percentage of it is about getting the food to them, and what percentage about is creating self-sustaining farming practices to help those communities really support themselves?
So that's really context specific. It depends if you're in the midst of a disaster and you're responding in a disaster response mode as opposed to post-disaster when a country is getting itself back on its feet and you can actually invest in development programs. So as an organization, we actually do both. Although we started out as a disaster response, and that's more of our expertise, as I mentioned, is really like those first critical days and weeks, bringing in the food, bringing in the clean water. But we do a lot now with the communities once they have post-disaster been able to stabilize, to bring in different investment, different technical experts to help them on some of the farming techniques that were mentioned that are no-till, that can, on their small plots, if they've got plots that are an acre or less, how they can increase those yields through the new seeds, through the new technologies, and help actually working with them to form cooperatives, get their products to the market. That's actually more of the side that we're on than the technical side, is actually helping them get their access to the markets. And also diversifying, because we've seen a lot of them that are producing crops that are for export, as was just mentioned, but are not crops that can particularly feed their families. So you see a lot of these farming families are actually the ones that are starving. They're either growing one type of food, so it's not a diversified diet, or they're growing a non-food item, it might be flowers, that are being exported somewhere to the West, so then their children are actually going hungry. So, so we're looking at some of those systemic issues like that.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, this is coming from a student, Matt. So now that we know how to make the bad soil good again, are the big companies reluctant to fix the soil because it would maybe take more time or more money, or what is the issue?
I think one of the big issues is habit. Habits are hard to break. Think about our own lives. The way we do stuff tends to shape the way we keep doing stuff. And it's very difficult to get people to change practices. And if you think about someone who owns, say, a small farm or even a large farm, and you've seen somebody adopt a new set of methods that will work for them, do you really want to run the same experiment and risk your livelihood for next year in experimenting on your farm? So what I've seen is like a major element of getting people to adopt these new, more conservation agriculture style practices are having demonstration farms, full-scale farms where people have done it, show that it could work, and can actually teach their neighbors and teach people in the region, oh, this is the rotation. If you're going to try a different rotation, start with this crop and then follow it with that crop, because I've tried it and it worked, and here's what I saved. That kind of example, I think, is really critical, and there's not a whole lot of demonstration farms in the country that focus on these methods and techniques. Most of the universities focus on one of them. They'll focus on testing no-till or testing cover crops or testing the diversity of a rotation. And what I found in researching Growing a Revolution was it was the combination of all three practices that allowed a rapid rebuilding of soil fertility. And by rapid, I'm a geologist, right? So I mean, not a lifetime, but at least a couple years. We started to see changes in our soil in our yard within 2-3 years. I've interviewed farmers who started to notice changes and got back to equivalent profitability in about 3 years. You don't see it in a year or two. There's all kinds of studies that compare the effects of new methods over the first year or the second year, the lifespan of the average master's student. You have to think a little longer than that. But the farmers I interviewed that had major transformations of their soil, taking it from less than 1% or 2% organic matter up to 5, 6, or 10%, depending on which part of the world they were in, because the capacity for soils to absorb carbon in relation to agronomic practices varies widely, geographically as well as with those practices. But I saw dramatic transformations in 20 years on farm after farm. And to me, that's incredibly rapid, because you think just back 20 years ago, it's not that, for some of us in the room at least, that wasn't that long ago.
Oh, thank you. I think we have time for 2 more questions, potentially, yeah? A little bit, a little more? Okay. So this is a great one. We'll see who feels they have some information. Could you please talk about the potential role of urban agriculture and the urbanization and urbanization increases and more people moving into city and what role that can play in food security?
Go ahead, take it.
Anyone?
So,
Anyone?
Yes, okay, here we go. So urban agriculture, whether it's farming actual land in the city or setting up rooftop gardens or growing crops agroponically or hydroponically in warehouses, these are all opportunities to grow local food with no transportation costs. But there are also a lot of challenges to making it work. Some of those warehouse-grown hydroponics, the investment is very large. And so to get started, it's not something that your local small farmer is going to do because, you know, you need $500,000 just to get started. So there are also, it does open up opportunities, though, for small growers to actually make a living within the city. And I think any opportunities that can support small farmers are beneficial in the long run. And it also builds, helps build community within a city as well. When the spin-offs are things like farmers markets and fresh produce and restaurants and sales to local stores, you know, it actually builds an agricultural system within a city. So I think there are lots of exciting opportunities, and some are available to small, low-income growers, and some are available to large entrepreneurial firms. But it seems like both things are happening right now throughout this country and in Europe as well.
And I'm going to jump in on this one only because I can finally talk about refugees. So there's a very interesting project of the International Rescue Committee here in the U.S. that is very innovative, and we're actually trying to help them replicate it. It's a project called Growing New Roots, and it's actually, you know, one of the things they found that's a vulnerability and of new refugees arriving here in the U.S. Is they are often not familiar with the foods. Their foods that they are accustomed to are not locally available. So this is actually a project that helps them identify and bring in seeds from their local countries and communities that they are able to grow in urban areas here in the United States. So food, it's an outlet because it gets, a lot, again, as I mentioned, a lot of women were used to being in agriculture as their livelihood before, and when they come here, they're stateless, rootless, they don't have a livelihood, they don't have the language, they don't have the skills. So this is a way actually to give them a productive outlet within their communities and also socially to get them their hands in the soil, but also the fact that they can grow things that they're familiar with and create meals for their children to keep those traditions alive. So,
thank you. So this one goes a little bit to U.S. Legislation and regulations. I'm going to see if someone can answer. I think David mentioned he has some opinions on this. So how does agriculture subsidies impact small organic farms? Would removing these subsidies allow for the free market to reduce to reduce prices? Or to increase prices, or let me see, to reduce market prices?
Well, I can't address the small organic farms directly, but all the farmers that I visited that were a range of farms across the U.S., almost to a person, they indicated that a restructuring of sort of federal agricultural programs and subsidies and crop insurance could greatly impact the way that they and their neighbors grow food in a very, very short period of time. Well, either way, but there's a very strong connection between those subsidies and the styles of agricultural practice, and in some ways resistance to change in those practices, particularly with crop insurance. I can't, as a geologist, I'm going to refrain from giving you suggested detailed policy revisions, but I do think, and I wrote about in the last chapter of the most recent book, that that's one of the big levers that we have in terms of changing the nature of farming and to try and promote the idea of building soil health as the next agricultural revolution. We should be rewarding farmers and subsidizing farmers who are actually adopting practices that are based on principles that will rebuild the health and fertility of their land. Because as public support, as public money, this is what we should be putting in. And the reality is, at the moment, we are subsidizing people to maintain practices that continue to degrade the land. And that is, is not good policy over the long run. And I'll defer to Rule in terms of the organic question. You may have more insight than I on this.
Well, just to clarify a couple of things, most of the subsidies are for commodity crops.
Yeah.
So if you're growing corn and wheat and soybeans and cotton, then there are subsidies that you receive from the federal government. There are also, for organic growers, if they were growing these commodity crops, they would receive those subsidies as well. But the vast majority of those commodity crops are grown on a very large scale, and there's some organic acreage, but it's really small. For a small vegetable grower, the only subsidy that organic growers have received for the past, 15 years or so is that there was a rebate for certification cost up to $750 from the federal government. So we have, let's say our certification costs at the farm are about $1,000 a year. We would get $750 back. And that reduced the barrier to certification, especially for a small farm. That could be 1% of the farm's gross if it's a small farm. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. But there are also some subsidies for conservation practices, and this is a positive thing where if growers leave land fallow, or they put in windbreaks, or they put in water catchment systems, they can get some subsidies from the government to do that. And that's been in a number of recent farm bills. So the subsidies aren't all negative, but the vast majority of money is, being spent to support very large farms growing commodity crops.
Yeah.
And I just want to add to that. Andrew Young was on TV the other day because of MLK's 50th, the 50th anniversary of his assassination. And he made the comment, he said, "We are not addressing root causes because we are so busy blaming others." He just kind of made that comment. So the reason that pops into my head now is, to me, there's an unfortunate part of the lobbying and regulatory process which is about fighting over big pools of money and blaming others and trying to kind of regulate and grab money to reallocate it, and which we have to do. That's like just the world we live in. We have to do that. At the same time, we need to create community-level new flows of capital that just get the money. It's not, in that case, you probably wouldn't call it a subsidy. You would call it a direct community investment by people who value the thing they're investing in. So just wanted to throw that in. That's a root cause to me.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add in here one thing, too, is that most people think of subsidies as federal. And there's a lot of alternatives out there as well. One thing that the Chef Fan Foundation's been working on is talking to governors about subsidies for school food if they're purchasing local. And so adding an extra subsidy onto the federal subsidy for local purchases. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to get to it. And it's interesting to connect to your local food organizations, food systems organizations, to understand what they are trying to advocate for in your state, because it sometimes is easier. Sorry, I interjected there, but I needed to. Okay, so this question is interesting. I'm going to add a little bit to it. But do any of you have anxiety over feeding a potential world population of 10 billion? And then I'm going to add on to it with a focus on small farms.
I think we all have thoughts on that. Go ahead, Woody. You go first.
Well, so to me, the problem with that question is posed in a very either or kind of global way that makes it hard to get at it. I'm just saying we don't have time on, so it's hard to know how to get at it. I would just say there is plenty of land. We are now there's so many different answers. We are producing right now enough food to feed 9 billion people on the planet, at least. There may be more than that. Today, the way everything, so there's plenty of land, there's plenty of resources to do what needs to be done. This is an economic and cultural question. It's not a food production question, although it is when you get into climate change and other things. But just in terms of our ability to produce food, we have more than enough capacity, and there's still plenty of soil left, and there's enough water to produce food for everybody. But our economy is skewing things and producing cheap commodities and is extremely inefficient. E.F. Schumacher said, the modern industrial economy is one of the most inefficient things ever invented. And it's like, what? I thought it was all about efficiency. So it's about a lot of small enterprise efficiencies at various transaction levels, and it's creating huge global inefficiencies like climate change, soil erosion, things. So it's a big question. My answer is, when there are 9 billion people, when there are, let's see, 7 billion people living in cities and 3 billion left in the countryside, which is where we will be when we're at 10 billion people approximately. Today it's roughly equal, it's a little more in the city. There will still be plenty of people who could grow plenty of food for all the people in the cities through a combination of means. And we should not be freaked out to stay on the current industrial system by the argument that we cannot produce enough food other ways. That is just not true.
Thank you. Do you have?
I think we both did. I was just
Oh,
saying,
we
if
all
we
did.
don't figure this out, we're looking at right now 60 million refugees flowing across borders. A lot of this is food and water crisis initially, even though it turns into other types of conflicts. But the root causes, we were talking about root causes, is often the food insecurity. So if we don't figure this out, we're at the largest number of refugees since World War II, and the situation is only going to get worse if we don't figure this out.
Yeah, and regional crises of that nature today become global problems.
Thank you.
They don't stay in the region. And Woody's right on a number of levels. And if you look today, we're sort of behind the question of could we feed the world of small farms in the future? There's almost the buried assumption that we're feeding the world of large farms today. We're not. We're feeding the world of small farms today. 3/4, I think, of the world's farms are smaller than 2.5 acres. Viewed globally, we're feeding the developed world with large farms. But if you look at where the food that's produced in the developed world goes, not a lot of it's going directly to feed people. We're feeding cars and we're feeding cattle and confined feeding operations. There's a whole different issue there. We talked about livestock earlier. It's not bad to eat meat from an environmental perspective, but it's not good to eat meat grown the way we do it conventionally today from an environmental perspective. There's places in the world where it makes a lot of sense to raise livestock, and it makes a lot of sense to reintegrate livestock and animal husbandry and cropping on farms around the world. And if you look at the efficiency question that Woody brought up, I wrestled with sort of 3 big myths of modern agriculture at the start of growing our revolution. One of them was that large-scale industrial agrochemical agriculture, each word intentionally in there, that's more efficient. It really depends what you mean by efficiency. And there's good NRC studies and other studies that have basically shown that small-scale diversified farms are more efficient in terms of their per input use. They grow more food per unit of fertilizer used, per unit of diesel used, and also per unit of land. So what's really efficient about large-scale industrial monocultures? You can grow more of one crop on a piece on an acreage. So more of a particular crop per hectare. But if you look at total food production per hectare, it's small-scale diversified farms that actually produce the most food. And that's not very well known. It relates directly to your question. You could turn it around and go, how could we feed the world with just large-scale industrial monocultures?
Well, the complex part is, it's probably going to take small farms and big farms,
Yes.
because there are some real economies of scale in terms of machinery when it comes to growing grains especially.
And not everyone wants to be a farmer.
And not everyone wants to be a farmer. The other complexity to this is that if the goal was for the U.S. to feed the world, and we wanted to stop growing biofuels and stop feeding a lot of animals, maybe the U.S. can actually produce enough grains and protein and carbohydrates to feed a lot of the world, but that's not really the solution that we want. We want the world to be feeding the world. We want Africa to be feeding Africa and India to be feeding India, because if it's any other way, there are going to be disasters, there's going to be wars, there's going to be, political leveraging that's really not going to work. So local food independence, I think, is an important goal here. And it makes feeding the world more complex, because we could feed the world, but can we feed the world and not have wars?
That's great. Well, you guys, we have come to our time. So could we please give a great big round of applause for our amazing panel. Thank you. There was a lot of questions we couldn't get to, so this is a great topic. So I hope we all keep talking about it. Thank you.
Hi. Nice to see you here.